Jimin held back tears in the recording studio. Jungkook hugged him tenderly. This moment moved everyone hut. A late-night recording session shatters emotional walls as hidden pain, loyalty, and love collide inside a silent studio. The glass trembled with the echo of a note that refused to die, and Jimin's voice cracked in the middle of the take as he whispered, "Stop the recording, please," his hand slamming against the console before anyone could react. The red light above the booth flickered off, leaving the studio suspended in a fragile silence broken only by the low hum of machines and Jimin's uneven breathing. The room smelled faintly of warm electronics and cold coffee, a familiar scent that usually felt like home. Tonight, it felt like a cage. Jimin stood motionless behind the glass, his headphones still on, shoulders tense as if he were bracing for an impact that had already landed somewhere deep inside his chest. From the control room, Jungkook was already on his feet. He didn't wait for permission, didn't glance at the producers frozen behind him. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped into the booth. The air inside felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Jimin's eyes were red, glossy, fixed on a point far beyond the microphone, as if the lyrics had dragged memories out of hiding and lined them up in front of him without mercy. "I'm sorry," Jimin said quietly, his voice barely audible now, stripped of performance and polish. "I thought I could do it." Jungkook didn't answer right away. He reached up and gently removed Jimin's headphones, the plastic brushing against his fingers, and set them aside. Up close, he could see the tiny tremor in Jimin's jaw, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, a habit he had whenever he was fighting himself. Jungkook knew that habit well. He had seen it in practice rooms at 3 a.m, backstage before concerts, in moments when cameras were gone but expectations still lingered like ghosts. "You don't have to," Jungkook said softly. His voice carried no pressure, no urgency, just presence. That was when Jimin finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt more devastating. His shoulders sagged, and a single tear slipped down his cheek, quickly followed by another. He turned away, ashamed, as if vulnerability were a mistake he had failed to correct in time. Jungkook closed the distance between them and wrapped his arms around Jimin without hesitation. It wasn't rushed or tight. It was careful, deliberate, as if he were holding something precious and fragile. Jimin stiffened for a heartbeat, then melted into the embrace, his forehead pressing against Jungkook's shoulder. The studio lights reflected off the glass, catching the image of them together, unaware that everyone outside had gone completely still. Jimin's thoughts spiraled despite the warmth anchoring him. The song they were recording wasn't supposed to hurt like this. It was meant to be hopeful, a message to fans, a promise of endurance. But every line felt like a confession he wasn't ready to make. The lyrics had clawed open memories of nights spent doubting his worth, of smiling through exhaustion, of carrying fears he never allowed himself to voice because he was supposed to be strong. He was supposed to be okay. "I keep thinking if I stop, everything will fall apart," Jimin murmured, his voice muffled against Jungkook's hoodie. "Everyone is counting on us, on me." Jungkook's arms tightened just slightly, enough to be felt. "You're allowed to fall," he replied. "I'll still be here, we all will." Those words hit harder than any high note ever could. Jimin inhaled shakily, breathing in the familiar scent of fabric softener and something uniquely Jungkook: comfort, safety, constancy. For a moment, the studio disappeared. There were no charts to top, no deadlines, no expectations pressing down on him. There was just this quiet, this shared breath, this unspoken understanding forged through years of standing side by side. Outside the booth, the producers exchanged glances but said nothing. No one reached for the talkback button. No one dared interrupt. They had witnessed countless emotional moments in their careers, but this felt different. This wasn't performance. This was truth unfolding in real time. Jimin slowly pulled back, wiping his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed but lighter. His eyes met Jungkook, searching. "What if I can't finish today?" "Then we don't finish today," Jungkook said simply, a small smile curving his lips. "The song will wait, you matter more." A soft laugh escaped Jimin, fragile but real. He nodded, straightening his posture, though his eyes were still rimmed with red. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like something he had to face alone. He glanced at the microphone again, not with fear this time, but with cautious resolve. "Can you stay?" Jimin asked. Jungkook smiled wider. "I wasn't planning on leaving." They stood there together for a moment longer before turning back toward the control room, hand brushing hand as they walked. The studio light seemed warmer now, the silence less oppressive. Whatever storms lay ahead, unspoken secrets, pressures yet to come, this moment had etched itself into everyone's memory as proof that even in the most polished rooms, raw humanity could still take center stage. And somewhere between a broken note and a tender embrace, healing had quietly begun. The door to the control room closed harder than intended, the sound cracking through the studio like a warning shot, and Jimin turned sharply as one of the senior producers finally spoke, his voice low but edged with frustration. "We can't keep stopping every time it gets hard," the producer said, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Jimin. "This album is already behind schedule." The words hit Jimin like a slap. He felt Jungkook tense beside him, a silent reaction that spoke louder than interruption. Jimin lifted his chin, forcing himself to meet the producer's gaze, even as his chest tightened. "I didn't stop because it was hard," Jimin replied, his voice steady but burning underneath. "I stopped because I was about to lie, and I'm tired of lying." The room went dead quiet. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were listening. Jungkook inhaled sharply, eyes flicking between Jimin and the producer, his jaw set. "Lie about what?" another voice asked, sharper, younger, more curious than cautious. Jimin hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the table, grounding himself in the cool metal. For years, he had mastered the art of silence, of swallowing words before they could betray him. Tonight, something inside him refused to retreat. "About being okay," Jimin said. "About always being strong, about never breaking." A murmur rippled through the room. Jungkook stepped forward then, unable to stay quiet any longer. "He's not a machine," he said, his tone firm, protective. "None of us are." One producer scoffed softly. "Fans don't pay to hear excuses, they pay to hear perfection." Jungkook laughed once, humorless. "Fans pay to hear us breathe, to hear us feel. If you don't get that, then you don't understand why they're still here." The tension spiked, sharp and electric. Jimin felt his heart pounding, fear and relief colliding inside him. He had said too much, or maybe not enough. His eyes drifted to Jungkook, who met his gaze without hesitation, a silent promise shining there. "Enough," the lead producer finally said, rubbing his temples. "Take 10 minutes, we'll revisit the track." Jimin turned away, heading down the dim hallway that led to the small lounge. The lights flickered softly overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch with every step. His breath shook now that the confrontation was over, adrenaline draining fast. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes, memories flooding in uninvited. Harsh rehearsals, forced smiles, nights spent staring at the ceiling wondering how much longer he could hold himself together. "You were brave back there," Jungkook said quietly, joining him. Jimin let out a bitter laugh. "I was reckless." "Maybe," Jungkook replied, "but sometimes reckless is the only honest option." Jimin opened his eyes, studying Jungkook's face, searching for doubt, for regret. There was none, just sincerity, raw and unguarded. That unsettled him more than the argument had. "Why do you always stand in front of me like that?" Jimin asked, his voice softer now, vulnerable. "Aren't you tired?" Jungkook's expression shifted, something fierce and tender crossing his features. "I stand beside you," he corrected. "And no, I get tired when you pretend you're alone." Silence fell between them, heavy but intimate. Jimin swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. He had built walls so carefully, brick by brick, convincing himself they were necessary. Jungkook had never bothered knocking. He simply stayed, waiting for the cracks. From down the hall, raised voices echoed again, arguments about deadlines, image, risk. The outside world pressing in, relentless. Jimin straightened, resolve slowly settling into his bones. "If I go back in there," Jimin said, "I'm not changing the lyrics, I'm not softening them." Jungkook smiled, a spark of pride lighting his eyes. "Good, then sing it the way it hurts. When they returned to the booth, the atmosphere was colder, sharper, but charged with anticipation. Jimin slipped on the headphones, heart racing, hands trembling only slightly now. The music began, deeper this time, heavier. When he opened his mouth, the sound that came out wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every word carried the weight of confession, every breath trembling with truth. Jungkook watched through the glass, fists clenched, eyes shining. He knew this moment would change things. Maybe not immediately, maybe not without consequences, but some lines once crossed could never be erased. And as Jimin sang through the pain instead of around it, the studio bore witness to something dangerous, controversial, and undeniably human. An artist choosing honesty over safety, and a bond strong enough to survive whatever storm followed. The final note faded, hanging in the air like a held breath, and for a moment no one spoke. The red recording light went dark, and the silence that followed was louder than applause ever could be. "That take," the producer said slowly, his voice carefully neutral, "can't be released as it is." Jimin pulled the headphones off, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere to go. "Why?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Because it's too raw," another producer cut in. "Because people will ask questions, because it sounds like a confession." Jimin laughed, sharp and hollow. "Maybe it is." Jungkook pushed back from the console. "That's exactly why it works." A tense exchange of glances followed. One of the executives who had been silent all night finally spoke, his tone smooth but dangerous. "We're not here to expose vulnerabilities. We're here to protect an image." Jimin stepped forward, his voice rising despite himself. "An image that's killing us." The word "us" echoed in the room. Jungkook felt it land in his chest. He moved closer to Jimin, standing shoulder to shoulder now, no longer trying to soften the confrontation. "You think fans don't feel when we're lying," Jungkook said. "You think they haven't grown up with us enough to know the difference." "This isn't about fans," the executive snapped. "This is about control." The word control cracked something open inside Jimin. His thoughts flashed back to years of being told when to smile, how to speak, how much of himself was acceptable. His voice dropped, dangerously calm. "Then you never wanted artists, you wanted puppets." The room erupted. Voices overlapped, sharp and heated. Someone accused Jimin of being unprofessional. Someone else warned Jungkook to stop escalating. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with ego and fear. Then a phone buzzed. Everyone froze as one of the junior staff stared at his screen, face draining of color. "The audio," he whispered. "Someone leaked part of the recording." "What?" the executive barked. The staff member swallowed. "It's already spreading. Fans are reacting fast." Jimin's heart dropped. Fear surged, followed by something unexpected: relief. The truth was out, even if only a fragment of it. Jungkook glanced at him, eyes wide, then burning with resolve. "They heard him," Jungkook said quietly. "You can't take that back." Panic rippled through the room as phones were pulled out, voices rising again. Words like damage control and statement flew around, cold and calculated. Jimin felt suddenly distant from it all, like he was watching from underwater. "What happens now?" Jimin asked, not to them but to Jungkook. Jungkook didn't hesitate. "Now we stop hiding." The executive turned sharply. "If you push this, there will be consequences." Jimin met his gaze, exhaustion and defiance mixing in his eyes. "There already are." Later in the empty hallway, the noise behind closed doors faded into a dull roar. Jimin leaned against the wall, finally letting his body sag. His hands trembled openly now. "I'm scared," he admitted, voice barely holding together. "What if I ruined everything?" Jungkook stepped in front of him, close enough that Jimin could feel his warmth. "Then we'll rebuild," he said, "together." Jimin searched his face. "Even if it gets ugly." Jungkook nodded. "Especially then." Jimin let out a shaky breath and closed his eyes, resting his forehead briefly against Jungkook's shoulder. The future felt uncertain, controversial, explosive. But for the first time, the fear didn't feel empty. It felt shared. Outside the studio, the world was already reacting, debating, crying, defending, attacking. Inside, two voices had finally stopped pretending. And whatever came next, it would be louder than silence and more honest than perfection. The conference room lights were too bright, exposing every crack no one had bothered to hide anymore, and Jimin felt the weight of the table beneath his palms as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "This is spiraling," the executive said, sliding a tablet across the table. On the screen, comments scrolled endlessly, words blurring into a storm of emotion, support colliding with speculation. "They're dissecting every breath you took in that clip." Jimin didn't look away. "They're listening," he said. "That's not the same thing." "You don't get to redefine the narrative," another voice snapped. "Not overnight." Jungkook leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp. "Maybe that's the problem. You've been defining it for us for too long." The room stiffened. Someone scoffed, someone else muttered a warning, but Jungkook pressed on. "You keep talking about risk like honesty is the enemy, but what you're afraid of is losing control." The executive's smile was thin. "Careful, control is what keeps careers alive." Jimin felt heat rise in his chest. "No," he said quietly. "Control is what almost killed mine." Silence slammed down. The words hung there, raw and undeniable. Jungkook's gaze flicked to Jimin, surprise and something like pain flashing across his face. He hadn't known it was that bad, not fully. "You should have told us," Jungkook said softly. Jimin swallowed. "I didn't know how. I thought if I said it out loud, it would become real." "It was already real," Jungkook replied, voice tight. The executive cleared his throat. "This isn't a therapy session." "Then stop pretending it's just business," Jungkook shot back. "You profit from our pain and panic when we name it." Voices rose again, sharper this time. Accusations flew about contracts, obligations, responsibility. Jimin felt himself shaking, anger finally overtaking fear. "You want us silent?" Jimin asked, standing abruptly. "Then don't give us songs that bleed. Don't ask us to pour ourselves out and then punish us for being human." One of the producers slammed a hand on the table. "You're jeopardizing everything we built." Jimin met his eyes. "You built a stage. We built ourselves on it." The meeting ended without resolution, tension trailing them into the hallway like smoke. As the doors closed behind them, Jimin's knees threatened to buckle. Jungkook caught his arm instantly. "Hey," Jungkook said, lowering his voice. "Breathe. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Jimin laughed weakly. "You keep saying that like it's easy." "It's not," Jungkook admitted, "but it's better than lying." They retreated to a quiet practice room, the familiar mirrors reflecting versions of themselves that felt older tonight. Jimin sank to the floor, back against the wall, finally letting the tears come. Not controlled this time, not hidden. "I was afraid you'd see me differently," Jimin confessed, voice breaking. "That you'd think I was weak." Jungkook crouched in front of him, eyes intense. "I see you braver than ever," he said. "You faced what I couldn't even name yet." Jimin looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Jungkook hesitated, fingers curling into the fabric of his sleeves. "Watching you sing like that, it cracked something open in me too. I've been holding things in, things I didn't want to look at." Jimin's chest tightened. "You don't have to." "I want to," Jungkook interrupted. "Because if you can stand there and bleed into a microphone, then I can stop pretending I'm invincible." They sat there in the dim light, vulnerability passing between them like a shared language neither had dared to speak before. Outside, the noise continued, opinions clashing, headlines forming. But inside the room, something steadier took shape. Later that night, Jimin returned to the studio alone. The equipment hummed softly, waiting. He stepped into the booth, hands no longer trembling. He sang again, not for approval, not for safety, but for truth. And somewhere beyond the glass, Jungkook listened, eyes wet, knowing that whatever followed, controversy, backlash, praise, it would never erase this moment. They were no longer hiding. They were choosing each other, and themselves, even if the world wasn't ready for it. The studio doors opened again before dawn, And this time the silence inside wasn't gentle. It was confrontational, waiting to explode. Jungkook was already there when Jimin arrived, seated on the floor with his back against the wall, knees drawn up, eyes dark from a sleepless night. He looked up the moment Jimin stepped in, relief and worry colliding in his expression. "They're calling another emergency meeting," Jungkook said without preamble. "This morning, higher level." Jimin exhaled slowly, setting his bag down. "So it's really happening." "It's already happening," Jungkook replied. "They're deciding whether to bury the song or bury us." Jimin let out a quiet, humorless laugh and sank beside him. The floor was cold, grounding. "Funny. I spent years afraid of breaking, and now that I finally spoke, they're afraid of what survives." Before Jungkook could answer, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, jaw tightening. "They want me alone first." Jimin's fingers curled unconsciously into Jungkook's sleeve. He caught himself and released it, but Jungkook noticed. "They're trying to split us," Jimin said softly. Jungkook nodded. "They always do when they're scared." The meeting room felt even colder than before. Jungkook stood across from three executives, their faces calm in a way that made his instincts scream. "You're influential," one of them said smoothly. "People listen to you. If you distance yourself from this situation, we can stabilize the damage." Jungkook's eyes hardened. "You mean distance myself from Jimin?" "We mean protect your future." "My future is tied to his," Jungkook replied without hesitation. "Whether you like it or not." Another executive leaned forward. "Be careful. Loyalty is admirable, but careers don't survive scandals." Jungkook smiled faintly, dangerously. "Neither do careers built on silence." Across the hall, Jimin sat alone in a smaller room, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He barely recognized the man staring back, eyes rimmed red, posture straighter than it had been in years. When the door opened, he braced himself. Instead of an executive, it was the producer who had argued hardest against him. "You know they're considering shelving you," the producer said bluntly. "Not officially, quietly." Jimin nodded. "I figured." "You could apologize," the producer continued. "Say you were overwhelmed, say it won't happen again." Jimin turned fully now, eyes sharp. "And live the rest of my life proving that lie." The producer hesitated. "You don't understand how unforgiving this industry is." Jimin's voice dropped, steady and fierce. "I understand exactly how unforgiving it is. That's why I won't let it own me anymore." When they reunited later, Jungkook found Jimin standing in the studio booth again, lights low, hands resting on the mic stand. He stepped inside without speaking. For a moment, they just looked at each other. "They offered me a way out," Jungkook said quietly. Jimin's chest tightened. And I told them, I'm not leaving you behind to make them comfortable." Jimin's composure shattered. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, gripping Jungkook's wrist as if anchoring himself. "You shouldn't have to risk everything for me." Jungkook's voice trembled, anger and devotion intertwined. "You think I'm not risking everything by staying silent, by watching you carry this alone?" Jimin's eyes filled again, but he didn't look away. "I don't know how to protect you from this." "You don't," Jungkook said softly. "You trust me to choose." The words settled between them, heavy and intimate. Outside the booth, news alerts exploded again, articles speculating, fans divided, truths half-told and twisted. Inside, Jimin finally spoke the fear he had buried deepest. "I was scared that if I stopped being the version everyone needed, I'd be alone." Jungkook reached up, brushing his thumb gently beneath Jimin's eye. "You're not alone, you never were." They recorded again that night, not just Jimin, but Jungkook too. 2 voices, imperfect and unguarded, weaving together in a way no one had planned for. It wasn't safe. It wasn't polished. It was undeniable. When they finished, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Whatever consequences waited beyond those walls, something irreversible had already happened. They had chosen truth over protection, connection over control, and in doing so, they had changed not only the music, but themselves. The news broke before sunrise, brutal and unfiltered, and Jimin read the headline on his phone with a strange calm that scared him more than panic ever could. Unreleased duet sparks internal conflict. Company faces backlash. Jungkook cursed under his breath. They leaked the duet. Jimin lowered the phone slowly. No, he said. They framed it. Screens around the world replayed fragments of their voices, cut and rearranged, stripped of context, until vulnerability sounded like rebellion and honesty like defiance. Commentators argued, fans cried and defended, critics dissected their expressions frame by frame. The world had turned their truth into a battlefield. In the emergency press room, tension was sharp enough to draw blood. Cameras waited outside like predators, lenses trained on a door that hadn't opened yet. You will not speak freely, the executive said coldly, sliding a prepared statement across the table. You will apologize for the confusion. You will clarify that this was a creative misunderstanding. Jungkook didn't touch the paper, and if we do... The executive's gaze hardened. Then you force our hand. Jimin felt something inside him snap, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, like a chain breaking. He stood. I won't apologize for telling the truth, Jimin said. His voice didn't shake. And I won't pretend this was a mistake. A sharp inhale cut through the room. You're being emotional, one of them snapped. Jimin turned to him, eyes blazing. No, I'm being precise. Jungkook rose beside him. If you want a statement, he said, here it is. We're artists, not products, and we're done bleeding quietly. The room erupted. Threats were thrown thinly disguised as concern. Contracts were mentioned. Futures were weighed like currency. Jimin listened, oddly detached, until one sentence cut through everything. You're replaceable. Jungkook laughed, low and furious. Then you never understood why people listened in the first place. When they finally stepped outside, the flash of cameras was blinding. Noise crashed over them, shouted questions, accusations, pleas. Jimin's heart hammered, but Jungkook's hand found his, fingers lacing together without hesitation. Are you ready? Jungkook whispered. Jimin squeezed back. I've never been more ready. They didn't read the statement. Jungkook spoke first, voice clear, unflinching. He talked about pressure, about silence, about how music saved them and nearly broke them too. Then Jimin stepped forward, the world narrowing to the sound of his own breath. I cried in the studio because the song was honest, Jimin said. If that scares you, ask why truth feels dangerous. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere in the crowd, someone was crying. Somewhere else, someone was furious. The impact rippled outward, uncontrollable now. That night, back in the quiet of the studio, Jimin sat on the floor, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Jungkook dropped beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Do you regret it? Jungkook asked quietly. Jimin thought of the fear, the fallout, the uncertainty clawing at the edges of everything. Then he thought of that first broken note, of the hug that had started all of this. No, Jimin said. For the first time, I feel whole. Jungkook smiled, tired but real. Then whatever comes next, we'll face it like this. The studio lights dimmed automatically, wrapping them in a soft glow. Outside, the world was still loud, still divided, still burning with opinion. Inside, two people sat in the aftermath of truth, hearts exposed, unhidden and unashamed. They hadn't won, but they had finally stopped losing themselves. Morning arrived quietly, almost respectfully, as if the world itself understood that something sacred had already been broken open and did not need further noise. Jimin woke to the soft hum of the studio lights shutting down, the automatic system ending a night that felt longer than years. His body ached with exhaustion, but his chest felt strangely light. Jungkook was still beside him, head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. For the first time in days, neither of them looked like they were running from anything. Jimin watched him for a moment, memorizing the calm in his face. You stayed, he whispered, more to himself than to Jungkook. Jungkook opened his eyes, a faint smile forming immediately. I told you I would. Outside, reactions continued to pour in support, criticism, confusion, but none of it felt sharp anymore. The worst had already happened. The truth had been spoken. Everything else was just echoes. Later that day, the company released a statement that sounded carefully neutral, stripped of authority it once carried. There were no threats now, only concessions. The song would be released, unchanged. Not because it was safe, but because it was impossible to erase. When Jimin stood in front of the microphone one last time, it felt different. There was no fear waiting to ambush him mid-note, no tightness clawing at his throat. He sang with a quiet steadiness, each word grounded, honest. Jungkook's voice joined his, not overpowering, not rescuing, just present. Two voices, equal, meeting in the middle. When the final take ended, no one rushed to speak. The producers sat still. The engineers didn't move. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was reverent. Jimin removed his headphones slowly and turned to Jungkook. "I thought being honest would cost me everything." Jungkook shook his head gently. "It gave you yourself back." That night, when the song finally went live, messages flooded in from people who felt seen, who cried in their own quiet rooms, who whispered thank you into the dark. Jimin read them with tears in his eyes, not from pain this time, but from release. He leaned into Jungkook's shoulder, letting himself rest there without guilt, without apology. For years, Jimin had survived by holding himself together. Now, he lived by allowing himself to be held. And in the stillness after the storm, surrounded not by perfection but by truth, they understood something simple and unshakable. The bravest thing they had ever done was not standing on stage, not chasing applause, not enduring in silence. It was choosing honesty. It was choosing each other. And finally, it was choosing to breathe, without fear at last.